Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a truly remarkable life today. It's Jane Manning James, a name that may not be familiar to all of you, but should be.
Oh, absolutely.
A fascinating figure in early Latter-day Saint history. And the best part, we're getting the story straight from the source.
Right, from her.
Her autobiography, dictated around 1900, talk about a direct line to the past. We're talking resilience, faith, and some really surprising insights into the early church, particularly through the lens of, well, race relations.
Right. And when you think about that, like this is meant to be read at her funeral.
Wow.
So this is really her, her unfiltered.
It's very personal.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not getting a biography from someone else.
Right.
Or an interpretation. You're really getting like her own voice and her own words
Right.
as she remembered and understood it.
Yeah. So to kind of set the stage a little bit,
Yeah.
She's born in 1822 in Connecticut.
Okay.
And she is born into a free black family, but it's really important to remember, the early 1800s, like even in the North,
Things were tough.
were not good
Yeah.
for black people.
Yeah, very limited opportunities.
Right. And to kind of further set the stage, slavery isn't fully abolished in Connecticut until 1848.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
Even though she's free, there's still this, huge.
Yeah, deeply ingrained racism.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Yeah, very difficult circumstances to be born into.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to keep in mind because she doesn't just find this new religion
Right,
and convert to it. She makes this unbelievable trek
Incredible.
to join the body of the saints, and we're going to talk about all that. But it's just to think about that context,
Right, it adds so much weight to her story.
and to even start to grasp Jane's journey, you got to get what America was like back then. Early to mid 1800s. I mean, slavery was just like built into the system. And even if you weren't enslaved, being black meant constant discrimination.
And yet, when I read about those hardships, it really makes you wonder, would I have had the same courage to leave everything behind for my faith, Because that's exactly what Jane did. Despite these challenges, she was clearly searching for something more, something to fill that spiritual void,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
She's born in Connecticut. And kind of like, what are those early years like for her?
Yeah, so she's born in 1822 in Wilton, Connecticut, to a free black family, as you mentioned.
Mm.
And from a very young age, like 6 years old, she starts working as a live-in servant for a prosperous white family. And that must have been difficult.
And we know she came from a family with at least 5 kids. And in 1841, she found her way to the New Canaan Congregational Church.
But that wasn't the end of her religious journey, was it?
She says, and I'm quoting here, "I did not feel satisfied. It seemed to me there was something more that I was looking for."
Yeah, that resonates with a lot of people, that feeling like there's something more out there.
Right, this searching.
Yeah, searching for truth.
Yeah. So about 18 months after she joins the Presbyterian Church, she hears an elder from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints preaching in her community. And this is where we really start to see, her conviction.
Yeah.
Because her Presbyterian pastor actually forbids her
Wow.
from going to hear this preacher.
Really?
But she goes anyway.
She's drawn to it.
Yeah. And she says, "I was fully convinced that it was the true gospel he presented, and I must embrace it."
And she does.
She does. And she's baptized the very next Sunday.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And, she doesn't just keep it to herself.
Right.
She tells her family. She tells her friends.
Yeah, she wants to share this new truth that she's found.
Right, right. So about a year after her baptism in 1842,
Okay.
she and 8 members of her family made this decision to sell their home in Wilton and go to Nauvoo.
That's a big decision.
It's a huge decision.
Yeah.
And they're giving up everything to do this.
Everything.
So who all goes on this journey with her?
So it's her mother, Eliza Manning, her brothers, Isaac Lewis and Peter,
Okay.
her sisters, Sarah Stebbings and Angeline Manning,
Okay.
her brother-in-law, Anthony Stebbings, and sister-in-law, Lucinda Manning.
Okay, wow. So they start out, on this journey.
Yeah.
And tell me about what that's like.
Well, they start out by canal. They're heading towards Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
And they think they're going to pay their full fare in Columbus, Ohio. But when they get to Buffalo, the canal company says, "No, you got to pay here, and we're not taking you any further."
What? So they're stuck in Buffalo and they're out of money.
Yeah.
Wow.
They have to get off the boat.
So what do?
They start walking.
They walk to Nauvoo.
800 miles.
800 miles.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable.
It's incredible, and Jane describes it so vividly. Like, she talks about how their shoes wear out, their feet are bleeding, they're just in so much pain.
I mean, I can't even imagine 800 miles.
It's unimaginable. And she says this: "Our feet became sore and cracked open and bled until you could see the whole print of our feet with blood on the ground."
Oh, my God.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and then what happens?
Well, in the midst of all this pain, something incredible happens. They stop and they pray together, and they ask God to heal their feet. And she says, "Our prayers were answered and our feet were healed forthwith."
So they're healed immediately.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a powerful moment.
Yeah, it really makes you think about, the power of belief
Right.
to help people through the hardest things.
Absolutely. And they needed that strength because the journey wasn't over.
When they reached Peoria, Illinois, local authorities stopped them, demanded to see their papers, proof they were free. Like, imagine that stress, that fear, always having to prove you're not a fugitive slave.
So even in states without slavery, that threat was real. The shadow of racism, it just followed them everywhere.
So what happens in Peoria?
Eventually, the authorities let them go, but they still have a long way to go.
Wow.
They have to cross a river with the water up to their necks.
Oh, my gosh.
And one night, they have to sleep in a forest, and there's a huge frost. Jane says the frost fell on us so heavy that it was like a light fall of snow.
You can almost feel the cold, the fear, the uncertainty, but also that unwavering faith.
It really makes you appreciate the sacrifices those early saints made for their beliefs. It's amazing that they kept going. But Jane says they continued their journey with joy. They sang hymns. They were grateful for everything.
That's incredible.
Yeah, their faith really sustained them.
Yeah. And then they get to La Harpe, Illinois, and they're just 30 miles from Nauvoo.
So close.
So close.
And there they meet a child who's very sick.
Okay.
The local elders have kind of given up hope, but Jane and her family, they administer to the child, and the child is healed.
Wow.
So they're getting closer to Nauvoo, and they're seeing these miracles along the way.
It's like a sign that they're on the right path.
Exactly.
So they finally make it to Nauvoo in the fall of 1843.
They do.
And where do they go?
They're directed to the Prophet Joseph Smith's mansion house.
Okay.
And it's such a touching moment when they arrive.
What happens?
Well, Emma Smith greets them at the door.
Oh,
She says,
okay.
"Come in, come in." It's just a simple welcome, but it means so much after that journey.
Right. And what about Joseph Smith?
Well, he immediately brings them chairs to rest, and then he talks to Jane, and he recognizes her leadership right away. He asks her, "You have been the head of this little band, haven't you?" And when she says yes, he says, "God bless you."
Wow. So he sees her as the leader.
Yeah, he respects her, and then he asks her to tell him about their journey, and when he hears about their faith, he turns to Dr. Bernheisel, who's there, and he says, "What do you think of that doctor? Isn't that faith?"
I love that.
And Dr. Bernheisel says, "Well, I rather think it is. If it had have been me, I fear I should have backed out and returned to my home."
So even he's recognizing how incredible their journey is.
Exactly. And then Joseph Smith says, "God bless you. You are among friends now, and you will be protected."
It's such a powerful moment of acceptance and kindness,
Yeah, it really is.
especially when you consider the times.
Absolutely.
So they stay at the mansion house for about a week.
Yeah, while the rest of the family finds places to live.
Okay, and what's that like for Jane?
Well, she remembers how Joseph Smith would greet them every morning and ask how they were doing. He really cared about them.
And then there's this thing with her trunk.
Oh, yeah, the lost trunk.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So Jane had entrusted her trunk to a man named Charles Wesley Wandle,
Okay.
and it had all her clothes and belongings in it.
Wow.
But somehow the trunk went missing.
Oh no, she loses everything.
Yeah, she's devastated.
And what happens then?
Well, Joseph and Emma, they hear about it, and they're so compassionate. Joseph tells her, "Don't cry, you shall have your trunk and clothes again." And then he brings Emma in, and she immediately offers Jane a place to stay with them. She says, "Why, yes, if she wants one."
So they just take her in.
Yeah, it's an incredible act of generosity.
It really shows their character.
It does.
So she ends up living at the mansion house.
She does. And what's that like?
Well, she wants to help out, so she offers to do housework. She even talks about washing Joseph Smith's temple clothes.
And how much reverence she felt doing that.
That's really special.
It is, yeah. And she mentions having conversations with other women in the house about plural marriage.
Okay.
Like Emily and Eliza Partridge and Maria and Sarah Lawrence.
Right, and this is all happening before Emma Smith makes that unusual offer to Jane.
And Emma offers to seal Jane to her and Joseph as their daughter.
Wait, what does that mean?
Okay, so sealing in the early church was this sacred practice that created eternal family bonds.
Okay.
So it wasn't just adoption like we think of it today. It had a much deeper meaning.
Right.
And for an African-American woman in the 1800s, this offer was huge.
Oh, they say that.
Back then, women, especially black women, had almost no legal rights or social standing, so being sealed to prominent white members like Joseph and Emma could give Jane a lot of protection and a sense of belonging.
It's like they were creating a family for her.
They were, and it was also a deep spiritual connection meant to last beyond this life. You know, it shows how much they believed in racial equality even when the rest of society didn't.
Yeah, that's really ahead of their time.
Absolutely.
So what did Jane think about all of this?
Well, she says she was hesitant at first and actually ended up refusing the offer.
Why is that?
She says she just didn't understand what it meant.
That makes sense.
It does, right? Even though Emma and Joseph were so kind to her, she still struggled with understanding this whole new concept.
Right, of course. But even without that sealing, Jane's belief in Joseph Smith as a prophet was rock solid. And we have her own words on this. She said, "I did know the prophet Joseph. He was the finest man I ever saw on earth. I was certain he was a prophet because I knew it." That's a powerful testimony. And what about her interactions with Lucy Mack Smith?
Well, Jane remembers Lucy telling her stories about Joseph's early struggles with the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
And then there's this incredible moment where she actually let Jane handle the Urim and Thummim. Being allowed to handle such a sacred religious artifact, you know, believed to be used for receiving revelations from God, that must have been deeply meaningful for Jane.
It suggests a level of trust that went beyond the, social norms of the time.
Absolutely. And Lucy tells Jane, "You are not permitted to see it, but you have been permitted to handle it. You will live long after I am dead and gone, and you can tell the Latter-day Saints that you was permitted to handle the Urim and Thummim."
That is so powerful. It's such a testament to Lucy's respect for Jane.
Absolutely.
So later on, when things are getting tough in Nauvoo,
Yeah.
Jane goes to Joseph Smith for advice. She's thinking about going to Burlington with her sister Angeline to find work.
And what does he say?
Well, he tells her, "Yes, go and be good girls and remember your profession of faith in the everlasting gospel, and the Lord will bless you."
That's so sweet.
I know, it's just this like fatherly advice.
Yeah, very caring.
This highlights another side of Joseph Smith, right? His role as a leader and counselor to the members of the church.
He wasn't just a figurehead. He was involved in people's lives, offering guidance and support. It's interesting to see that personal side of him.
Yeah. It humanizes him, doesn't it? Shows that he was more than just a prophet. He was also a friend, a mentor to those around him.
Unfortunately, that time of mentorship would be cut short.
This is important. Joseph Smith, he was totally against slavery. In 1844, he even ran for president, and his platform, abolishing slavery, gradually by 1850 through compensated emancipation. Pretty radical for the time.
Hugely. It shows his commitment to a more just society. And sadly, that same year, Joseph and his brother Hiram were murdered in Carthage, Illinois. And here's a detail that just sends chills down my spine. The mob that attacked them, they were reportedly wearing blackface.
Ugh. Yeah, that just throws the whole racial climate of the time into sharp relief. The hatred, the violence, it was so deeply tied to race.
It's a horrific reminder of the dangers they faced. And after Joseph and Hiram's deaths, things got even worse for the saints in Nauvoo. More mob violence. Eventually, the city's charter was revoked. And that's what led to the exodus west.
Right. In 1846, under Brigham Young's leadership, they started that incredibly difficult journey. And Jane, who by then was married to Isaac James, she was among the thousands who left. They ended up in winter quarters, Nebraska. And amidst all that upheaval, Jane and Isaac had a son, Silas. June 1846. Talk about resilience.
Yeah, starting a family in those conditions. Incredible. And finally, in July 1847, the first group of pioneers reached the Salt Lake Valley. What was the black community like in those early days?
Well, by the end of 1847, there were 12 African Americans in Salt Lake. 8 were former slaves. Names like Oscar Crosby, Harkley, Greenflake, mentioned specifically in the text. And Jane and her family, they were the only free black people in that initial group.
So a mix of experiences all coming together in this new place. And the black population in the Utah Territory, it grew pretty fast, didn't it?
It did. By 1850, it had more than quadrupled, mostly former slaves who had converted and were looking for a fresh start. And unlike a lot of other Western African American communities back then, which were mostly men, black Utahns in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were mainly families, husbands, wives, kids.
Which is interesting, right? It speaks to a different kind of community building.
Yeah.
And there's another contrast the text brings up. Most churches in the U.S. were super segregated. But the early Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it had black members right from the beginning.
That's a big point. despite all that segregation, there were black members who held the priesthood, like Elijah Abel. In 1836, Joseph Smith said right out loud that Abel was entitled to the priesthood and all the blessings. He was ordained an elder, later a 70. And get this, he kept his priesthood even after later policies changed. He even got a patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr. So there was a time when things were more integrated.
It's a reminder that things weren't always as they later became. And it seems Joseph Smith's anti-slavery stance attracted some black converts, like William McCary. But his story, it gets pretty complicated.
Yeah, McCary arrived in Nauvoo in late 1845, claimed he was Okatubby, the son of a Choctaw chief, but he was also understood to be black. He was baptized in February 1846, married a white woman named Lucy Stanton, then went west with the Saints to winter quarters.
And in winter quarters, things took a turn, a strange turn.
McCary started claiming he was Jesus and Adam. He was also super worried about his racial status, told Brigham Young and other leaders he wanted to be treated equal, regardless of his race. Brigham Young, according to the text, said, "We don't care about the color. It's nothing to do with blood, for of one blood has God made all flesh." But Young also told McCary to, repent, get his act together.
And at first, the leaders tried to support him, right?
Yeah. The Quorum of the 12 even helped him get a wagon and supplies so he could keep going west. But then it came out that he was performing unauthorized polygamous sealings in his house, basically engaging in what the text calls sexual misconduct.
So he was excommunicated. And the text says his actions had a huge impact on later church policies regarding race, leading to restrictions on black men holding the priesthood and black members getting temple ordinances.
Yeah, that's important to get. The text argues that what McCary did, combined with the racial prejudice that was everywhere and the craziness of the Reconstruction and civil rights eras that came later, all of that led to these bans continuing, not just because of skin color, but like a sense of we got to protect ourselves during these volatile times.
But throughout her life, Jane remained a devoted Latter-day Saint. She raised a family, participated in temple ordinances, and never wavered in her faith.
What has stood out to you most about Jane's story so far? What sparks your curiosity as we move forward?
It's incredible to think about all that Jane Manning James had already lived through by the time the Saints reached the Salt Lake Valley. She played an active role in building this new community, and her autobiography gives us a glimpse into daily life in those early years.
Yeah, she talks about the joys of family life. She and Isaac had 10 children, and she describes the abundance they experienced in those early years, raising livestock and spinning cloth to clothe her family. You get a sense of that pioneer spirit, that self-sufficiency that was so essential for survival on the frontier.
It sounds almost idyllic in a way, but I'm sure there were also plenty of hardships.
Absolutely. She also recounts the devastating cricket war of 1848. Imagine swarms of crickets descending upon the valley, destroying crops, and leading to widespread famine.
Oh, wow, that must have been terrifying, especially with a young family to feed. Did she ever lose hope during those difficult times?
Jane describes the heartbreak of hearing her children cry for bread when she had none to give. It's a stark reminder of the harsh realities they faced. But even in those moments of despair, she held on to her faith, her belief in God, and the restored gospel was her anchor.
That unwavering faith is a recurring theme in her life. It's inspiring to see how her belief sustained her through so much adversity. Even in those moments, she says, "But in all, the Lord was with us and gave us grace and faith to stand it all."
Her faith is just incredible.
In 1850, Congress made Utah a slavery territory, which adds a whole other layer to the racial dynamics.
Totally. And after the Civil War, you had the Reconstruction Amendments trying to guarantee equality.
Right.
But they were resisted like crazy by states and the federal government for decades. It took till the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for those promises to really mean something, long after Jane was gone.
And the text is really clear. The Reconstruction Era. More dangerous for racial justice than slavery itself.
No doubt. It was violent. Groups like the KKK, the Knights of the White Camellia, the White League, the Red Shirts, they used terror to keep black people down, targeted them and anyone who supported them. And the text brings up the assassinations of Joseph Smith and President Lincoln. More examples of this racially motivated violence that was just everywhere.
It's hard to fathom that level of violence and how nobody was really held accountable. And these groups, they work hard to stop black people from voting, keep white people in power. It was systematic.
It was a complete disregard for the law, a deliberate attempt to take away black people's rights. And even Utah, which had some early integration, passed an anti-miscegenation law in 1888, plus more segregation laws, especially when the all-black 24th Infantry showed up, which, ironically, made the racial anxieties even worse.
So much turmoil. And it's in this climate that Jane, who never lost her faith, tried again to get her temple endowment and be sealed to Joseph and Emma Smith. That blessing Emma had offered her years earlier.
Makes sense, right? With all this unrest, maybe feeling her own mortality more, she wanted those deep spiritual connections. So between 1884 and 1904, she petitioned church leaders. John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Zena D.H. Young, Joseph F. Smith.
And they said no, every time. Because of the racist laws, the violence, the oppression all around them, it's just heartbreaking.
It is. And the text explains, during this time, Black Latter-day Saints, men and women, they couldn't participate in most temple ordinances. Yeah. Though it had happened before. It was a direct result of those restrictions after the McCary incident and just the whole national racial climate.
But there was one bright spot. Stake President Angus M. Cannon, in 1888, he gave Jane permission to perform baptisms for her dead relatives, even though it was risky for him.
Yeah, that was a big deal. He acknowledged her faith, her connection to her ancestors, and she eventually got to be sealed to the Joseph Smith family by proxy in 1894, but only as a servant.
The text really drives this home. To get why Jane was denied for so long, you got to understand how volatile things were before and after slavery, how that shaped everything.
Exactly. The context is key. And sadly, Jane died before things started to change, before the ideas of freedom, tolerance, acceptance that we talk about now, before those became more widespread.
Jane Manning James's life, it's just extraordinary. Her faith, her resilience in the face of such deep prejudice. This deep dive, it's been a look into a dark chapter in American history and religious history, and it's all seen through the eyes of this remarkable woman.
Before we move on to discuss Jane's lasting legacy, let's pause for a moment and consider what resonates most with you about her life in Utah.
You know, we've journeyed with Jane from her conversion in Connecticut through that incredible 800-mile trek to Nauvoo. We witnessed her life intertwined with the Smith family and really felt the echoes of her resilience in the Salt Lake Valley.
And through it all, it's her unwavering faith that truly stands out. Jane's story isn't just about overcoming those external obstacles.
Right.
It's about that inner strength, that wellspring of belief that helped her navigate both the joys and the sorrows of life.
As someone who, loves history, I've read countless accounts of the early Latter-day Saints.
Of course.
But it's one thing to read about those experiences in a textbook.
Yeah.
It's quite another to hear it through the voice of someone who lived it. And Jane's autobiography gives us that, that raw, unfiltered perspective.
It's a perspective that continues to resonate, more than a century after her death.
Yeah.
I think it speaks to the enduring power of those personal narratives, especially those that challenge us to confront those uncomfortable truths about the past and inspire us to create a better future.
Despite facing discrimination and setbacks, she never questioned her belief in the restored gospel.
No.
It speaks to such a profound level of conviction, a deep spiritual connection.
I think that's what makes her story all the more powerful, too. It's not just about overcoming adversity.
Right.
It's about finding meaning and purpose in the midst of it, holding on to hope even when things are difficult.
Exactly. And that's a message that resonates with people from all walks of life, regardless of their religious beliefs.
Absolutely.
Jane's story reminds us that faith, in whatever form it takes, can be a source of strength and resilience in the face of life's challenges.
These huge historical forces affect people's lives, their faith, their hopes. It makes us think about where we are today, how far we've come, and how far we still have to go to build a world where everyone is truly equal, truly included.
A world where those echoes of the past don't hold people back anymore?
Exactly.
Well, listeners, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
Till next time.
And keep thinking, keep learning, keep pushing for a better future.
For everyone.